The first thing she remembered about the day the Vorkai came was the smell of frying oil and the sound of her mother singing off-key through the walls of their shipping container. That was 3 years ago. The singing had stopped the same afternoon. Mira was 19 now, brown-skinned and wire-thin. With oil-stained fingers, she could never quite get clean, and a name she'd inherited from a woman who died before the evacuation ships finished loading. She lived in Sector 9 of the Kael-Thar resettlement zone. Kael-Thar being the Vorkai word for the collection of prefab modules and salvaged industrial bulkheads that the human population of what used to be Jakarta had been permitted to occupy after pacification. The Vorkai called it a resettlement. The humans who lived there called it the yard, because that was what it looked like from above. A junkyard, vast and tangled, threaded with smoke from cooking fires and black market power taps that flickered brown at dusk. The Vorkai did not come into the yard. Their atmospheric drones made lazy circles over it twice a day, cataloging thermal signatures and logging population drift. And occasionally a compliance officer would park a transport at the outer perimeter and process papers with the dull efficiency of someone counting sacks of grain. Inside, the yard governed itself. Rather, the yard was governed by whoever had enough food and enough knives to enforce a claim on a given block. Mira had neither food to spare nor knives worth displaying. What she had was a pair of hands that understood machines in a way that felt almost involuntary, like a reflex she'd been born with. The Vorkai had stripped the city of anything with a power cell above a certain threshold. That was the pacification condition, the thing they traded for stopping the thermal bombardment of coastal centers. But they'd left the mechanical world largely alone. Hydraulics, gears, springs and valves and compression chambers. The yard was thick with Vorkai cast-offs, cooling units from their barracks, processing housings from logistics depots, conveyance rigs that had failed their maintenance cycles and been dumped rather than repaired. Mira repaired them, not for the Vorkai. Anyone in the yard who needed something to move, or cool, or hold pressure when pressure needed to be held. She was on her back under a salvage compressor housing when Ko found her. Ko's real name was something longer and Hokkien in origin, but she'd been called Ko since before the yard existed, since the days when she'd worked the docks at the old port and acquired the reputation that followed her now like a second shadow. She was 40, broad-shouldered, with a scar on her jaw that she'd gotten in the first week of pacification and had since turned into a signature, a mark she'd stopped people from covering when the field medics came. She ran a block of 30 people near the center of the yard, and she ran it cleanly, which in the yard was remarkable enough to be a kind of legend. "I need you," Ko said, crouching beside the compressor housing so she could look Mira in the face. "Not your hands." Mira slit out from under the machine. There was grease on her cheek and a bruise on her forearm from where a hydraulic clamp had caught her the previous morning. She sat up and looked at Ko the way she looked at everything, direct, quiet, measuring. "What happened?" Mira asked. Ko set down a small object on the concrete floor between them. It was a Vorkai command chip, roughly oval, matte black, the size of a thumb. Mira had never held one. She'd seen them, distantly, locked into the housing units of compliance drones and logistics vehicles. The Vorkai used them as authorization keys, as override modules, as the root-level authentication tokens for the entire automated architecture of their occupation infrastructure. "Where did you get that?" Mira said. It wasn't quite a question. Dako got it, and now Dako is dead. Dako had been Ko's partner, mechanic, scavenger, the person in the yard most likely to do something spectacularly reckless and survive it. The past tense landed with a particular weight in the space between them. Ko said. He pulled it from a compliance drone that went down in the eastern sector 2 nights ago. System fault, not us. It just fell. He was there when it fell and he cut it open before anyone else arrived. Chip was hot. She paused. He didn't die from the chip. He died from being seen taking it. Mira looked at the chip without touching it. The Vorkai know he had it? They know someone took it. They don't know it came to me. Ko sat back on her heels. Voice was the same register it always was. Level, unhurried. But Mira had known her long enough to hear the current underneath it. Before Dako died, he told me what it does. He'd been working on it for 18 hours. He said the chip, When it slotted into a Class 7 compliance junction, broadcasts a signal that the automated distribution network interprets as an authorized resupply command. The network responds by cycling the distribution sequence. It opens the allocation terminals across the entire sector grid. Ko looked at her steadily. All of them. At once, Mira was quiet for a moment. In the yard, the allocation terminals were the single most significant physical fact of daily life. They were Vorkai-controlled dispensaries, protein substrate, water purification tablets, the antibiotic compound that kept respiratory infections from becoming funeral pyres. Kai released them on a schedule that maintained dependency without permitting accumulation. A calculation so precise it was almost elegant. If the terminals opened simultaneously and unsupervised, people could take what they needed, not what the Vorkai determined they needed, what they actually needed. For a week, maybe 2. He died for this, Mira said. He died because he was stupid and brave and he did things in the wrong order, which is why I'm bringing it to you instead of doing it myself. What's the junction? Ko pointed up in the direction of the northern perimeter. Substation 7. I know where it is. I know how to get there without drone coverage. There's a shadow lane through the processing ruins that the thermals don't read cleanly. I don't know how to slot the chip. She looked at Mira's hands. You do. Mira picked up the chip. It was lighter than she expected. The surface was covered in Vorkai micro-textured circuitry, the patterns densely recursive. And she found herself reading the structure of it the way she'd learned to read a bearing assembly or a valve train. Not as language, not as meaning, but as geometry. The chip had a logic she could follow with her eyes. She couldn't have explained how she knew that. She just knew it. You'll need 2 others, she said, for the approach. The shadow lane, how wide? 2 abreast. Then I need 1 more person and I need them to be calm. Ko nodded. She didn't say the name she was already thinking of, because she didn't need to. They moved at the 3rd hour past midnight, when the drone cycles overlapped and produced an 18-minute window of degraded coverage across the northern sector. The window was irregular, and the timing was never guaranteed. But Ko had been mapping drone behavior for 6 months, with the obsessive patience of someone who had decided observation was survival, and she trusted her numbers. The 4th member of the group was a man named Tomas, a former electrical engineer from Sao Paulo who had been in the yard for 14 months and who had not spoken more than 3 consecutive sentences to anyone in all that time. He communicated primarily through the quality of his silences, which were precise and expressive in ways that actual speech rarely managed. When Ko asked him to come, he had simply stood up from where he was sitting and put on his jacket. That was the conversation. They moved through the processing ruins in single file, Mira behind Ko, Tomas behind Mira. The ruins had been a logistics depot before pacification. One of the early bombardment targets hit before the terms were accepted. The roof collapsed and the walls partially standing, creating a maze of shadow and rebar that the thermal drones, Ko insisted, could not reliably parse. Concrete smelled of old fire and standing water. Mira kept her left hand on the wall, and her right hand closed around the chip in her jacket pocket. She thought about Daco. She hadn't known him well. Ko's people and her own overlapped but didn't fully coincide. But she remembered him at the edge of a communal cookfire once, laughing at something nobody else had found funny, his face completely uncomplicated by the laughter. He had that quality some people had of finding genuine amusement in genuinely bad situations, not as armor but as reflex. It wasn't courage, exactly. It was something more involuntary than courage. She thought about her mother singing through the wall. She thought about the 18-minute window and whether they were inside it. Substation 7 was a squat hexagonal structure at the northern perimeter, 40 meters from the compliance fence. Accessible from the ruins if you crossed 12 meters of open ground that Ko had already mapped for drone blind spots. They stopped at the edge of the ruins, and Ko pointed to a spot in the fence line shadow. 18 seconds, she said. Shh. Mira looked. She measured the distance the way she measured everything. Not with instruments, but with the kind of attention that converted space into time. 12 meters, 18 seconds. The numbers were tight, but they were numbers, not hope. After you, she said to Ko. They went in 2 pairs, Ko and Tomas, then Mira alone. Ko's call to lighten the second crossing. Mira crossed the open ground at a steady walk, not a run, because Coke had told her that thermal drones flagged rapid heat dispersion faster than slow movement, and she had decided to believe Co the way she believed well-constructed mechanisms. Provisionally, completely, until evidence required otherwise. The station door had a Vorkai compliance lock. Standard architecture, Class 3. The kind on every secondary installation in the yard's perimeter. Mira had never cracked one from the outside. She'd repaired 3 from the inside. On maintenance jobs contracted through the compliance office's occasional use of yard labor. She crouched in front of it and took out a tool roll from her jacket. Co watched the perimeter. Tomas watched Co. The lock housing had 4 contact points, arranged in a compression square. The chip, as Mira understood it from Dako's notes. Transcribed by Co from memory, in Co's angular handwriting, on a piece of synthetic packaging, had to interface with the junction through the lock's internal authority port, which was accessible from outside only if you removed the contact point housing. Removing the housing without triggering the pressure sensor inside it required depressing 2 contacts simultaneously while rotating the housing counterclockwise. A thing that required 2 instruments and 3 hands, unless you improvised. Mira improvised. She used the narrow end of a torque driver to depress the first contact, clamped it in place with a folded strip of insulation tape from the tool roll, and used the freed hand to depress the second contact while she rotated the housing with her third finger. The housing came loose. The sensor did not trigger. She heard Co exhale behind her. The authority port was inside, a hexagonal recess, black composite, exactly the size and orientation she'd expected from reading the chip's geometry. She seated the chip. She felt it click. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the station hummed, a sound below hearing, felt in the sternum rather than the ears. Then a cascade of smaller sounds from further away, from across the yard, from the allocation terminal blocks, the click and hiss of mechanisms releasing, hatches opening, the architecture of control cycling through an override command and responding the only way it knew how, with compliance. Co grabbed Mira's arm and pulled her upright. Move. They moved. Back across the open ground, into the ruins, through the shadow lane at a pace that was very close to a run. Behind them, the station hummed and then went quiet. Ahead of them, somewhere in the dark interior of the yard, Mira could already hear voices, confused at first, then sharper, people waking and moving toward the sound of the terminal's opening. They were 50 meters into the ruins when Tomas put a hand on Mira's shoulder. She stopped. He was looking up. Above the roofline of the ruins, a drone hung in the air. Not the standard oval patrol unit. This was a compliance drone, bulkier, slower, the kind that responded to system irregularities rather than running scheduled routes. Its attention light was amber, not red. It hadn't locked onto them yet. It was still evaluating. Co said very quietly, "Don't move." They stood motionless in the shadow of a collapsed section of wall. The drone moved laterally, its sensors sweeping. The amber light pulsed. Mira felt the chip still warm in her jacket pocket. She'd pocketed it again out of reflex after seating it. And she understood now that this was a problem. Chip was active. It was broadcasting. The drone was homing on it. She thought about Dako, cut open in the eastern sector, with a hot chip in his hand. She pulled the chip from her pocket. She looked at Co, whose face was a precise study in the suppression of panic. She looked at Tomas, who was watching her with the calm, focused attention of someone who had done something irreversible once before and learned what it felt like. She set the chip on the ground, pulled the narrow torque driver from her roll, and in one careful motion she unseated the chip's power side contact, not destroying it, not disabling the signal it had already sent, but interrupting the active broadcast frequency, the thing the drone was following, the thread it was pulling. The amber light pulsed once more, went green. The drone drifted away on its patrol arc. Co let out a breath so slowly it was nearly inaudible. Tomas picked up the chip from the ground and held it out to Mira, and she took it, and they walked the rest of the way through the ruins without speaking. By dawn the yard was transformed in the small and specific ways that matter more than large ones. Not riot, not celebration. The terminals had opened at 2 in the morning, and the people closest to them had moved quietly, with the practical efficiency of people who knew instinctively that noise attracted attention, And that attention, in the yard, was never an asset. By 3, the distribution had broadened. Co's network, and the network of every other block leader who understood what was happening, functioning the way the yard's informal structure always did in a crisis, as a mesh rather than a hierarchy, information traveling laterally without needing anyone to authorize it. Mira sat at the edge of Co's fire as the sky lightened. She was drinking something that passed for coffee, Chikark's substitute, bitter enough to strip enamel the best available, and she was watching the yard wake up around her. People moving with food, not rushing, not hoarding, or at least not openly. The social calculus of the yard understood that visible hoarding invited redistribution of the violent kind. Just people moving with food, with the quiet purposefulness of individuals who had been uncertain of tomorrow for 3 years, and were spending one morning being certain of it instead, sat down beside her. She had a flask and she filled Mira's cup without asking. The compliance office will know by midday, Co said. I know. They'll cycle the locks. Chip won't work again. Different protocol key. I know that too. Co looked at her. Then, what are you thinking? Mira wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth was real and the morning was cool. And she held the sensation carefully, the way she'd learned to hold things she wasn't sure she'd have again. I'm thinking that the chip's architecture is readable. I understood the geometry of it in about 4 minutes. She paused. And I'm thinking that the terminals have a manufacturing architecture, built by someone, somewhere, from components. The components have tolerances. Tolerances can be found. Co was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're not talking about the chip. No. You're talking about the terminals themselves. I'm talking about the fact that a machine that opens can also be made to open, chain, without a key. If you understand what the lock is asking, and you know how to give it the answer it's expecting. Mira looked at her hands. The grease under her nails, the calluses, the small scar on her right index finger, from a cutting wheel that had slipped when she was 16. I've been repairing their cast-offs for 2 years. I know how they build things. The tolerances, the load paths, the points where cost-saving produces compromise. She looked up. Every machine has those points. Doesn't matter who built it. Co looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear but occupied the territory between them. Then she said, We'd need more people, trained people. Just Tomas, people who can learn this. I know. And we'd need time. Months, maybe. Probably. And the Vorkai will figure out that what happened last night wasn't a system fault. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but they'll figure it. Yes, Mira said. They will. Co picked up her flask, looked at it, put it down without drinking. I need to know something, she said. What you're describing. It's not just about food. It's not just about the terminals. You're talking about understanding their entire infrastructure well enough to operate it without their authorization. Yes. That's not repair work. Mira looked at the yard. The patchwork of shelters and cooking fires and people moving with quiet purpose in the early light. The layered complexity of 30,000 people, surviving in a space built for machinery. The stubborn, unscripted persistence of it. The way it kept being human despite all available incentives to stop. She thought about her mother's voice through the wall. She thought about Daco laughing at something nobody else found funny. She thought about the amber light that went green because she understood, at a fundamental level, what a machine was asking and how to answer it. They built their whole occupation on the assumption that we can't understand what they built, she said. That the gap between their engineering and ours is too large to cross, too primitive, or too, she chose the word carefully, too comprehensively human to think the way their systems think. Co waited. They're not wrong that there's a gap, Mira said. But they're wrong about what the gap means. They design their systems the way everything gets designed. Around the assumptions of the people who built them. And the people who built them have never had to survive in a place like this. She held up the chip, the small thing Daco had died for. Its surface covered in geometries, she could read the way she read a bearing race. We have. That's the gap they didn't calculate for. 6 months later, the compliance office filed 3 consecutive anomaly reports that it could not resolve. First involved a series of minor distribution irregularities across 4 allocation terminal clusters in Sector 9. Not outright unauthorized openings, nothing that tripped a full audit protocol, but statistical deviations in disbursement timing that the monitoring system flagged as inconsistent with standard drift parameters. An investigation found no mechanical fault and no tampering evidence. The report was filed as unexplained and archived. The second involved a logistics vehicle on its return route from the outer depot, finding its navigation systems briefly overridden for 11 seconds, long enough to redirect it 40 meters off course before the master system reasserted control. The vehicle was unloaded when it happened, and the incident produced no material loss. The anomaly signature was consistent with an encoding error in the road surface transponder grid. The investigation concluded it was probably that. Probably. The third report, which did not produce an archived finding because the compliance officer who filed it was reassigned before completing the documentation, concerned something more difficult to categorize. Several residents of the yard had been observed, on multiple occasions over a 3-week period, engaging with Vorkai infrastructure installations in the outer maintenance zone, not sabotaging them, not stealing from them, simply looking at them, with a focused and sustained quality of attention that the surveillance analysis AI classified, in its own notation, as study. Nobody above that compliance officer's pay grade thought to correlate the 3 reports. The moment Mira knew they had, it was not dramatic. It arrived in the form of Tomas, standing in the doorway of the workshop she'd built from salvage in the interior of the yard, holding a piece of paper on which he'd written 2 numbers. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the small model of a Class 7 junction interface she'd built from Vorkai cast-off components over the previous 4 months, sitting on the workbench in front of her, and she looked at the numbers again. The numbers were the resonance values of the authorization handshake protocol. She'd been trying to calculate them from first principles for 2 months. Tomas, who had spent 11 days in the maintenance zone doing what the surveillance AI had recorded as study, had simply measured them. He had built, from components that cost him nothing, a passive listener that read the handshake in real time and recorded its frequency signature. Then he had written the numbers on a piece of paper and handed them to Mira. She looked up at him. He shrugged slightly. The shrug said, "You would have gotten there." The shrug also said, "I was faster." The shrug said, "Underneath both those things, we are allowed to be good at this." Mira put the numbers on the bench. She picked up the junction model. She had already, in the previous 2 months, worked out the physical architecture of the answer. The shape of the key that the lock was asking for. She'd built and rebuilt that part 12 times, each iteration closer, each failure informative in the specific way that failures are informative when you're learning. Rather than guessing, she had the shape. She had not had the handshake. Now she had both. She built the first complete device in 3 hours. It was small enough to fit in a closed fist, unremarkable enough to sit unnoticed among the debris of any yard-adjacent industrial area, and capable of producing an authorization handshake indistinguishable, at the protocol level, from a Vorkai compliance chip's active signal. She put it on the bench. She sat in front of it for a moment, the way she sometimes sat in front of a just-finished repair, not admiring, exactly, but present in the specific way that making something required, acknowledging the gap between the thing as it was in her hands and the thing as it had been in her mind, and finding them close enough to constitute a correspondence. Then she called Ko. They did not use it immediately. Ko had a habit, one of her better ones, of sitting with a plan until the plan revealed its weakest points, and the plan that they built over the following 3 weeks was built with Ko's patient pessimism threaded through every decision. Who knew what? Who could be trusted and to what degree? What the compliance office's response pattern looked like after a distribution anomaly, and how long the post-incident heightened monitoring typically lasted. They mapped it all out, and they found the places where the plan was thinner than they wanted, and they reinforced those places with contingencies. And when the contingencies were solid, they found the places where the contingencies were thinner than they wanted, and they reinforced those. Mira built 4 more devices. She trained 5 people including Ko and Tomas in their operation. The training was 3 sessions each, practical rather than theoretical, focused on the specific physical actions required and the specific failure modes to watch for. She did not explain the underlying architecture to anyone except Tomas, because the underlying architecture took 2 months to understand, and they did not have 2 months, and because understanding the architecture was not what any of them needed in order to act. What they needed was to know what the device asked of them and what it would do if they delivered it correctly. On the night of the operation, 8 months after Dako's death, 5 months after her first compliance anomaly report, 3 years and 2 weeks after the day Mira's mother stopped singing, they moved in 5 separate groups across 5 separate sectors of the yard's outer perimeter. Ko ran the northern group, Tomas ran the eastern. The other 3 groups were run by people whose names, 6 months earlier, Mira had known only well enough to exchange nodding acknowledgments with at shared cookfires. Mira ran the central group because the central junction was the most architecturally complex, and because complexity was her native terrain. They moved at the 3rd hour past midnight. They did not move in the compliance drone's window. They had spent 3 weeks establishing, through careful observation, that a moving group of 4 people in the yard's interior produced a thermal signature statistically identical to a returning work crew, and that the patrol drones did not investigate returning work crews. This was information that the Vorkai would eventually update their protocols to address. Tonight it was still true. The central junction was a squat column of Vorkai composite embedded in the northern wall of a maintenance corridor, accessing the distribution network's backbone layer. Not the terminal clusters, not the secondary allocation points, but the root network itself. The chip had done to one sector 8 months ago, the device would do to the entire yard. Not for one morning. As long as the network took to isolate and override the signal, which Ko's modeling suggested, was between 72 and 96 hours. 3 days of open allocation. 3 days of the yard taking what it needed from a system built to dispense what the Vorkai decided it needed. Mira held the device in her right hand and crouched in front of the junction housing. The housing was newer than the one in Substation 7. A different generation. The tolerances tighter. The contact points more deeply recessed. She had anticipated this. She had built the device with a longer interface stem. And she had practiced the seating angle 17 times on the model until it was automatic. She thought about nothing in particular. She heard her mother's voice, briefly and without choosing to. Not the song. She'd lost the exact tune of the song years ago, that specific frequency dissolving the way frequencies do, but the quality of it. The unself-conscious pleasure in the making of sound, the small, human act of singing in a shipping container. Because singing was something you could do that no exterior condition had yet found a way to prohibit. She seated the device. The junction hummed. A sound below hearing, felt in the sternum. Then the cascade, the same cascade as before, but larger, deeper, running further through the infrastructure, reaching everywhere the network reached. The architecture of control, cycling through an override command, and responding the only way knew how. Somewhere in the yard, she heard the first terminal click open. Then another. Then the sound of people already awake, already moving, because Ko had seeded the word carefully over the previous 48 hours, moving it through the yard's informal mesh, the way everything important moved there. Not as announcement, not as instruction, but as the kind of information that arrives in the shape of a question and expects the recipient to understand the answer themselves. Mira pulled the device free and pocketed it. It was still usable. She had already, in the previous 2 weeks, begun training 3 more people on its construction. She stood up. The maintenance corridor was empty and cool and smelled of old composite and the particular metallic quality of Vorkai engineering, which she had come to know as well as she knew any material she'd ever worked with. Alien technically. In practice, just another set of tolerances. Just another set of points, where cost-saving produced compromise, where the assumptions of the builders left gaps that the builders hadn't thought to account for. She walked back into the yard. The light was just beginning at the eastern edge of the sky, and the yard was waking up in the way it had that one morning 8 months ago. except larger. More voices, more movement, not just Sector 9 but all of it. The patchwork of 30,000 lives doing what they had been doing for 3 years, with or without authorization, persisting, adapting, making something functional from whatever was available. Ko was at the edge of the main thoroughfare, standing with her arms crossed and an expression that was not triumph. Ko didn't do triumph, found it imprecise, but was instead a kind of deep and considered satisfaction, the expression of someone who had done a calculation correctly and was now watching the result. She saw Mira and lifted her chin. Mira walked to her. They stood together and watched the yard receive what it had taken. "They'll know," Mira said, "by tonight. Yes, the response will be different this time. Not anomaly reports." "No," Ko agreed. "Not anomaly reports. We need to be ready to move the devices and move the people who know how to build them." "Already started." Ko looked at her. "You're not surprised by any of this." "By what?" "By the fact that it worked. By the fact that you—" Ko paused, choosing the word with the care she gave to important things. "That you could." Mira thought about this. She looked at the yard. The fires and the shelters and the people moving with food, with the quiet certainty of people who had decided, at some point she could not exactly locate, that surviving was not the same thing as enduring, that there was a difference between being alive and merely not being dead, and that the difference was worth the cost of understanding it. "I was always this," she said. "They just never thought to check." Ko was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that was the closest she ever came to laughter. Brief, low, real. And she handed Mira the flask, and Mira drank, and the sky above the yard continued to get lighter, which it had done every morning of the occupation and would continue to do regardless of what the Vorkai decided to do about it. That was the thing about mornings. They didn't require authorization. Somewhere in the yard, someone was humming. Mira couldn't identify the tune from this distance. She stood and listened anyway, until she could hear it clearly enough to carry it with her. Then she went back to work.